Hey, what's going on, guys? Dom the Movie Nerd here, and have you heard the good word? Game of Thrones is back! Well, not really, but the first official spin-off, House of the Dragon, is set to premiere next year on HBO, and that got me thinking about how Game of Thrones, the #1 most-watched show for a decade, just seemingly disappeared from the culture after that god-awful finale. And I wanted to find out why, which is why I'm proud to present the newest hit show from the Talkin TV network, Talkin Thrones, the new weekly show where myself and friend of the channel, Professor Pat Huber, get together to break down each and every single episode of this hit show. We've got focus character segments, we break down the lore, we go over some old reviews, all to get to the question of where did this show go wrong? It's a really fun time. You guys are not going to want to miss this. So head over to the Talkin TV channel on YouTube and Spotify to check it out. We go live every Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Audio goes up the following Saturday. It's going to be a really great time as we once again battle it out for the throne. All right, we're wrapping up October, wrapping up Shock-tober with the last big, I guess you could say, quote-unquote, big release of October. It's going to be interesting to see how many people watch this or even kind of know about it, with Edgar Wright's 7th feature film, if you count the Sparks Brothers documentary that he did last night in Soho. And I'm back with somebody who has not been on the podcast since January of 2020, pre the pandemic even, Mr. Brandon Fallat. I just came up with a B Fallat in the name right there because I couldn't think of a nickname real quick off the top of my head. But you ready? You looking forward to this?
Yeah, should be good. Can't wait.
All of that and more. Stay tuned. All right, so I am back with my good friend Brandon Fallat, who again not been on the podcast in January of 2020. Needless to say, a lot has happened since then, just in general, you know. But we stayed.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, right. I have no idea, no clue. But anyways, how you been, dude? It's been a minute since we've had you back on.
Good. I'm just I'm out here in Pittsburgh post graduation, and things are going good. How are you?
Living the life. What's it called? Care to clue us in? Your job perspectives? Anything you got going on? You continuing the great illustrious newspaper quota memorandum? I don't know. I'm just riffing words off the top of my head right now.
I mean, I haven't done any newspaper reading or writing, no. But yeah, I'm working as a videographer, photographer, and it's going pretty good so far. That's awesome.
Yeah. So Brandon, obviously, in order to clue the rest of you guys in, because we've gained a lot of new audience members since the last time you were on here, just to clue the YouTube viewers in, just in general. Brandon and I worked together back when we were both in college here at delightful SUNY Oswego. We were editor and co-editor for the entertainment section for the Oswegonian, and it was a lot of fun. We had a lot of bonding experiences, both to discover that we had an equal mutual love of movies just in general. Remind me, did we ever actually see anything together, though? Because I don't remember us actually ever seeing it. Damn. Crazy times, man.
I think I asked you, but you just...
Probably more than I was busy. I had a lot of stuff going on back then. Still do, well, for the most part, but not as busy. But it's good to see that. It's good to see that things have definitely gone upward for you, just in general, since then. But it's funny because I was talking about this weekend. Chris, of course, tells me, he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna be in Boston this weekend, so I'm not gonna be able to do it." And I'm like, "Crap! I really didn't feel like doing another solo podcast because I've done that a decent amount of times. I already did that twice this year for Space Jam 2 and the Candyman remake." Needless to say, I really didn't want to do it again, just in general, even though this movie, I can safely say, was an infinitely better movie than those two. But I just happened to be like texting you. It was weird. I wasn't even texting you with the intention of having you co-host the podcast. I just wanted to see how you'd been. And then a random thought just popped up on my mind. I'm like, wait a minute. And then I texted, would you have happened to have seen Last Night in Soho, Edgar Wright's new movie? And you were like, yeah, I actually just walked out of it. I'm like, oh, yes. Oh, man, talk about timing. And it ended up working out well, just in general. So I guess before we get this started, Brandon, talk about your relationship with Edgar Wright. Talk about, like, what you think he is.
Well, he's a good guy.
Your close personal relationship with him. No, your thoughts on him as a director, like, what you think of each of his movies just in general. Because Edgar's one of those guys that you don't really think of him as being that influential, because it feels like every single time he has a movie, it's almost like they're destined to become a cult hit. But like, they don't have the makings of one, if that makes any sense. Like, all of his movies theoretically should work for a conventional audience, but they always have that cult classic edge to them. Like, I don't know. What's your take on that?
I think he's a great filmmaker, and yeah, I see what you mean, because a lot of his movies end up becoming cult hits as opposed to just being hits right when they come out in theaters. I think Baby Driver is probably the only one that was a pretty good box office hit when it first came out, and people seem to dig it. That was a much more mainstream movie that he did. But as far as him as a filmmaker, I love his style. I think it is very influential on the filmmaking generation that we haven't seen yet. You know what I mean? Like, the people that I think are most influenced by his work have yet to really hit the Hollywood scene in terms of the way he edits and the way he uses music and the way he tells a story and that type of a structure. So I think he's great. And I think Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is a perfect movie. So
yeah, absolutely, dude. Like, if
there ever was a perfect movie.
If there ever was. And it's still, I think the most baffling thing to me about Scott Pilgrim is the fact that he had all the stars in that movie that he did at that time. Because if he tried to make that movie now, with the amount of people who are in the movie now, the movie would have a minimum budget of like, what, $3 billion, something like that,
yeah,
just in order to equal the cast salaries, something like that.
It was just before they all got big, really.
Yeah, like right on the cusp of stardom for like it was crazy, because that was pre, I'm trying to think, I think that was even pre Short-Term 12 for Brie Larson, if we're talking. Like, Mary Elizabeth Winstead still had a couple more years before that. Chris Evans was 1 year away from Captain America. I feel like the only one that didn't was Brandon Routh, but Brandon Routh ended up landing like the CW stuff right afterwards, so he ended up blowing up pretty big. So yeah, my whole thing on
Kieran Culkin
now finally with Succession. Although Kieran Culkin was already kind of a weird household name. I don't know, the Culkin brothers. It's a kind of a weird thing. I don't know. What's your take on Rory Culkin, the third Culkin brother that seems to be unknown except for the people who remember him from Signs? But
I don't know who that is.
It's funny because for the longest time, Mel Gibson's two kids in Signs, I thought it was brother and sister Spencer and Abigail Breslin, but it turned out it was only Abigail Breslin's the daughter. The son was Rory Culkin, and then ironically enough, Spencer Breslin would pop up a couple years later, and M. Night Shyamalan's critically acclaimed The Happening. But anyways,
wow, I always thought it was just the two of them.
Yeah, crazy times, right? But no, so my whole thoughts on Edgar Wright as a director is that it's shocking to me. I think the biggest thing is how little movies he's directed in such a short amount of time, because it feels like every single time I go into the well, it's like, oh man, his movies are like so influential. You talk about Shaun of the Dead, and that movie I feel like is like so far transcended, like kind of the almost like pop cult, like satirical status that it has, and it's like become like a well-known like contributor like to the zombie genre, and like people regard that as like one of the go-to movies when it comes to like zombie things. And then you talk about Hot Fuzz, which, even though it's parodying all of the crazy action stories that have come out previously, it still has a lot of those awesome action sensibilities. Like, there's straight up riffs that like actually work like really well, like the Point Break stuff and the Bad Boys stuff. And then it gets to Scott Pilgrim, and the whole thing there is that's just such a great kind of emblematic like representation of like kind of the hipster counterculture, but almost like to a fault, and like exposing some of the problems with that. It like Scott Pilgrim is one of those things where I've seen it 50 times and I still can't really put a leg down on it. But the thing that I've noticed in each and every one of his movies is that his style, being very eclectic that it is, again, a lot of whip pans, a lot of quick cuts and edits, a lot of close cut inserts, just in general. It has this very frenetic, fast pace, right? So it was already kind of introducing, right, a lot of the fast paced stuff that you see now in like every movie. So in that sense, he was really ahead of his time. And I think that's a big reason why he's always had such a hard time previously, I think, kind of inserting his movies in the moment, because his movies have always been so far ahead of its time in the sense of that goes. So that's one thing. The second thing is kind of how he chooses to characterize his movies, which I note a very distinct difference, I think, besides the overall genre factors, which we'll get into it further in the conversation, as far as how he characterizes his movies. I'd like to think pre his stint with Marvel with What Almost Happened with Ant-Man, and post his stint with Marvel with What Almost Happened with Ant-Man, where every movie that he had prior to, even the one that did not happen to star Simon Pegg, obviously that being Scott Pilgrim, it's his characters are always man-children. And that, right, and this is the 2000s, which is the decade that like where almost every single comedy was about like a man-child, the guy who refuses to grow up. Again, you look at the late 2000s alone, like Knocked Up, Step Brothers, to an extent, Pineapple Express, although that's a little bit different. You know, like
Todd Phillips, all this.
Exactly. Like, you're coming off a decade of comedy that seems to be centered around predominantly white males who just are stuck in this one period of immaturity and constantly need to push themselves forward. But Edgar, and again, I'm not going to necessarily say that it's because he brings the British sensibility, because usually, like, I usually like to poke fun and say that British humor is usually a lot smarter than American humor just in general, is that Edgar's got a very, let's call it, classy way of presenting it, right? Like, because when you watch Shaun of the Dead and you start that movie, in any instance, right, prior to like a zombie apocalypse per se, you would just say, you're like, okay, that's just a regular schlubby guy who just can't seem to get his life together, you know? But you're not necessarily thinking off the top of your head that they're like, oh, that's somebody who like has problems per se, you know? And same thing with Hot Fuzz, right? And same thing with Scott Pilgrim. And all of these movies, he kind of like, I think does this really interesting thing where he has this kind of journey as far as bettering themselves, while at the same time, like, kind of poking fun at the genres that they're in. But then you have the whole Ant-Man thing, where famously, obviously, it's one of the biggest talked about things, where Edgar Wright famously is hired as the director for the first Ant-Man film. And then after a lot of like production and behind the scenes unknown problems, he famously left the project. It's one of the biggest. This happened a couple times in that like mid 2000s period of Marvel before they really settled in and, you know, started to become the dominant force in pop culture in 2016. But he ended up walking away. And famously, he did state that even though they parted on amicable terms, it's like, I was really interested in making a Marvel movie, but they weren't interested in making an Edgar Wright movie. And I find that fascinating because that's still like the most public disparaging between like a director and an actor. Obviously, there's the whole Patty Jenkins thing that happened with Thor: The Dark World, but then that went the way that it did, you know? And the interesting thing is that within Ant-Man as a movie, even though, again, Adam McKay's influences are all over that, and Paul Rudd obviously had a hand in the screenplay, and then finally when they brought on Peyton Reed to direct, it's like you can still see bits and pieces of Edgar Wright's humor in there, and it's very, very obvious. And I think what's been really fascinating is ever since the whole Marvel thing, right? After the whole World's End kind of tied off the Cornetto trilogy, right, in general, I think just that trilogy in general was really fascinating. How he examined each of those movies, even though they were playing different characters, through the mire of Simon Pegg and Nick Frost's kind of relationship as they developed throughout those three movies. And ever since Ant-Man, it's almost like he's kind of switched gears and kind of like wanted to dive more so and applying his tactics towards like traditional genre fare, you know, Baby Driver, which is very, very much indebted to like the works of Walter Hill with, you know, his Driver movie, you know, and it's ironic too that it's only 6 years after Drive, you know, and it's very kind of similar, though very totally different. And now with Last Night in Soho, where he's taking a look at almost like, you know, doing like a mix between like Giallo and Argento, as far as like, you know, those really interesting, like kind of European, what's the term that I'm looking for? Like Gothic horror, just in general, you know, I don't know. What's your take on all that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious if that was intentional on his part, or is, you know, because at the end of the day, he is a film fan. So I think when he's deciding whatever his next creative endeavor is going to be, he's looking at things that are resonating with him. And if it's some car movie from the 70s about a driver, or if it's one of the films that you mentioned that kind of relates to Last Night in Soho, I almost wonder if that's more of a springboard for him to say, like, what would I do with a movie like that, as opposed to his first 4 films, which were more him developing his own style, and now he's just applying it, like you said, to different types of conventional stories. Yeah, I think it's great, and I think with Baby Driver and Last Night in Soho, he's giving different types of films than what we have prior, and I like that. You know, even though they don't have the same flavor as those first 4 that he did, you can tell that it's still in keeping with his creative vision. It's still uniquely his, and it's you know, you're just seeing the evolution of an artist, I think.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of fascinating because I've always tried to nail down like what it is that makes an Edgar Wright movie an Edgar Wright movie. Because that's really the fascinating thing, right? Is that we talk about auteurism within filmmaking all the time, right? And it's kind of ironic in the sense that, so auteurism formerly was, okay, within all these myriad of studio movies that kind of feel exactly the same, you know, throughout the 30s and 40s in the history of Hollywood, let's try and, you know, it was like whenever a director would like throw in that one thing that would like kind of break the mold, and it would like, you know, clue people in who were like sort of their fans and be like, okay, that's that guy, you know, that's what auteurism was previously. Then throughout the years, like once the 70s happened, once the 60s and 70s happened and things really started to shift and change, it more so became, okay, this director, Hollywood now needs these directors more than they need the studio system, right? In general, it was like, again, it was kind of this really good synergy that happened there. And so the directors essentially turn themselves into like kind of these, into kind of like these, distinct like commercializations in a sense where it's like, okay, whenever you watch like a Spielberg movie or a Scorsese movie or a George Lucas movie or a Brian De Palma movie, you're getting like this one distinctive vision, this one distinctive kind of a tone, these distinctive filmmaking techniques. Like with Spielberg, the big thing that he loves doing is he loves doing the single takes that start with a wide and then eventually center in the one character, when with Scorsese with the Catholic guilt and the violence, and Coppola obviously with the shades of red in his filmmaking, the stuff that would like essentially brand the films as the directors, right? And now it's almost in a weird way done this complete 180 where a lot of those old school directors, it's like those styles and sensibilities have kind of been cultivated by the studio machine in order to apply them to all of these kind of like, not blame, but like all these kind of, these blockbusters that we've been getting recently that all end up kind of feeling the same. And it's almost like whenever we get a film from an auteurist director, it's almost like it's even harder for them to actually stand out and have a visual style. But that's also has to do with the accessibility of technology just in general. And so I guess the number one thing about just Edgar Wright just in general, before we actually, transition into Last Night in Soho, is first off, it was just so beyond refreshing to have a movie that was so tonally and distinctly different than really any movie that he's done previously, but still have all the stuff that makes the Edgar Wright stuff, that immediately tells you, okay, this is an Edgar Wright movie. It's the same thing with Baby Driver, where again, Baby Driver and Last Night in Soho, you put those two movies next to each other, totally different movies, but the opening scene, you put them next to each other, you can instantly tell that that's an Edgar Wright movie. Just again, with the way that it's following the characters. Of course, with the jukebox sensation, just pouring the music over every single second, the kind of the whip pans around as it's following the character. Usually you'll have little to no dialogue in the opening sequence. It's a lot of very visual storytelling. It's one of the things that I still respect about him a lot. He is a very, very visual storyteller. And almost to a point, and this goes back to Shaun of the Dead, where, again, the visual cues that he throws in there are like jokes and referendums and Easter eggs. Like, he famously almost like, he almost like repatented the idea of the Chekhov's gun by literally having it be an actual gun in Shaun of the Dead. And it's still one of the best jokes in that entire movie. And all of those sensibilities are found here, but in kind of a new sense where it's almost like he's reminding you, it's like, yeah, I'm still here, because like I look at his styles, right? Like I notice a lot of similar stuff in Aronofsky movies and Guy Ritchie movies, like when he was first breaking on the scene, and now all those stylisms have kind of been lost in the studio system, but he's still kind of, out there like making his bones just in general, with these really distinctive offers. And I think that's also why he hasn't hit the level of mainstream success and recognition that he may have wanted. But also, I don't know if he necessarily needs it or wants it at this point, because let's face it, the Edgar Wright fans who love his movies, they love his movies. And the people who understand and know that his movies are some of the best, like they know,
Yeah, I totally agree.
So let's get into this movie. So Last Night in Soho. So this film obviously was famously disrupted, like everything else, from COVID-19. Originally supposed to open last year. It got its release date shifted a couple times because I don't know what it was, but all the studios wanted to drop all their movies in October. Just in general, you had many say No Time to Die, Halloween Kills, and Dune. All back to back in a way, oversaturated to say the least. I still don't understand why they don't think they could drop anything in September. Why we only have Shang-Chi and then Malignant has like a brief moment of time in September to shine. It's like I still remember back. Right? Did you remember? It was like either 2018 or 2019, but one of the 2 years when we were both at the newspaper, and I think it actually might have been. Yeah, I think it might have been fall 2018. And it was around September, and we were rolling out articles. We were getting in all these reviews for all these terrible horror movies that came out, right? And at the time, right, we expected that, right? We're like, well, look, we're not going to throw shade. We know who these movies are made for. But the thing that kept baffling us is we're like, why do they keep releasing these movies in September? Why not October for horror movies? It was like it was the same thing that year when the first Danny McBride Halloween movie came out, but they didn't
release it on Halloween. And it was the same thing this year. I'm like, I don't get it. What am I missing here? Just in general. I'm like, is it like to try and get like the slow roll to keep people coming back until Halloween? And like, so that consistently baffled me. But I think the ironic thing about this movie, just first and foremost, is that this feels like the perfect Halloween movie, and it opened on Halloween, which was like Halloween weekend. You know, we're recording this, obviously, you know, when this episode goes live, it'll be, you know, Monday, November 1st, but we're recording this episode on Halloween, October 31st. And this, to me, I don't know about you, feels like the perfect Halloween movie. Just again, like the sensibilities, the styles, like kind of the spooky kind of supernatural feeling that's in the air, just in general. Like, I don't know, did you get that feeling?
It gives a far more spooky and mysterious vibe than I got in Halloween Kills.
In Halloween Kills, I knew you were going there. Oh man, that movie just look. Chris and I already talked to death about that movie, and hopefully the less said the better. But the movie basically opens up. We're following Thomasin McKenzie's character Eloise, who desperately, you know, she wants to be a fashion designer. It opens up in a very traditional Edgar Wright sense. She's dancing around a room as 60s jukebox music is playing, of course, with the vinyl record player. You got to have the hipster sensibilities in there. And her whole thing is, again, she wants to be a fashion designer. She gets into this prestigious fashion design school in London, but the whole thing that's established about her, two things that are established. Number one, she doesn't fit in with anybody kind of her generation, her age. I can very much relate to that. She's stuck in the past, right? Her mom died when she was at a very young age, and so she's been raised by her grandmother. So she's been raised with the sick, you know, literally, again, outside of London, outside of like the mainstream, in like, you know, kind of the quiet suburbs area. So she's been raised kind of with, you know, the sensibilities of old. And all she wants to do is she wants to live in the 60s. She wants to, you know, see the style, see the times, see all the clubs. You know, she's got this very grand, romantic view of the 60s, which Edgar Wright famously talked about. It's like that was a big source of inspiration for him in the 60s, was the fact that like he always was fascinated by it and wanted to have discussions about it with his parents. But his parents were always like very straight-laced and very straightforward and never really gave him a whole lot of like intonation to area to work around. And so he was constantly like obsessed with this idea of like kind of having a dream and then having to wake up to reality. And so I think automatically off the bat, I think that's established really well here, where she moves to London. She what's it called? She starts going to school. She's living in the dorm, immediately finds out that she hates living in the dorm life. Like, again, just with her flatmates, you know, just, you know, them doing the, you know, the partying every night lifestyle kind of a thing. And she is just not having it. She just wants to curl up in her bed, put on her very not at all obvious Brandon Beats headphones, and then just listen to 60s music. And after a while, she finally says she's had enough. She ends up moving out. She ends up moving into this flat that has a long history in it. And she ends up, this is the other thing that's established, is that she is kind of sort of a seer. She can commune with the spirit of her dead mother. It's very strange in how it's established. It's not really established like super cohesively. And she ends up starting to have these dreams about this girl portrayed by Anya Taylor-Joy in the 60s and starts following her around. And as the film goes on, it starts to become a mystery about like kind of what happened to her as she like kind of starts. And what happens is at the halfway point, the movie does this 180-degree shift where it starts off as like this very, you know, nostalgic ode to the 60s, like she's living the life, you're following her throughout. It's kind of cool just again seeing like a traditionalist film sense, just following a character through their journey with a lot of visuals and not a whole lot of talk and explanation. And then the film pivots in the middle half in order to become like this murder mystery, supernatural murder mystery almost with hints. So that's all I'll say kind of as far as what the film's about before we actually get into the spoilers. But non-spoiler thoughts, Brandon. What were your thoughts coming out of last night in Soho?
I thought it was a solidly entertaining film. I thought the cinematography was gorgeous. I thought Edgar Wright shot it beautifully. It felt like an Edgar Wright movie despite him kind of throwing away some of those typical motifs that he usually uses. I thought, you know, all the technical aspects of filmmaking I thought were on point, whether it was the performances or the production design, the wardrobe. I thought it was probably some of his finest work in terms of like music choices. I know he's always got a knack for that in his films, and there were some sequences here where the songs he picked, you just kind of sit back like, wow, like that is absolutely perfect. Which song he picked for that. I think it was probably lacking in certain areas, not in terms of the story itself, maybe in terms of the writing of the story and the execution of things, especially towards the end. It does feel a little all over the place at times. And there are some tropes in there that are a little like, all right, we're doing the 2000s Mean Girls. We're going to do I don't want to get into the twist yet, but you get into a certain twist at the end, you go, oh, we're doing this. Okay. and it's certainly, I think overall it was a really good movie. I personally enjoyed it more so than Baby Driver, which is his, out of his filmography, the only one to compare it to, even though they're very different films. They're kind of representative of like this new era of Edgar Wright, like you said, post and pre his Ant-Man debacle.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really dug it. I know a lot of people either love it or like they think it's kind of bad. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a really solid movie, and especially for the Halloween season, I thought it was really well placed.
Ironically enough, because again, this movie got its release date shifted like 4 or 5 times. I think they were originally going to put this out in the summer of all places, like they did with Baby Driver. And I'm just like, why? Of all things that would have been just an absolute disaster, when this was the summer that was like clearly marked by COVID, and they were just trying so hard to just like put movies back in theaters and try and show that they could make money. No, I'm going to be honest. So going into this movie, I was skeptical, like I've been with every single year. Like 2021, I don't know how 2021 has been for you with movies, Brandon, but I've watched a lot of movies this year, and I can safely say this has been the least satisfying year movie-wise since 2016, when I kind of started this whole movie watching journey. Like 2017 and 2018, I've kind of come around on. Again, a lot of those movies in hindsight, I found that a lot of those movies in the moment weren't as satisfying for me as they are in hindsight. I know that you have some disagreements, but I saw a lot of bad stuff in those years, and like a lot of bad stuff. Like, but I will say, so I've come around on Blade Runner 2049. I do love that movie now. I've come around. Oh man, there are a couple others that I've come around on that I did not like originally. Lady Bird I always liked. Florida Project took me a couple. Oh my God, there was one other one from 2017 that I hated originally, but then it took me a couple times to watch. And then I finally.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I what's it called? I
Daddy's Home too.
Yeah, definitely. But no. But I can safely say that Edgar is one of the few directors that still is not disappointed, because you're right. Even with all the moments, there were a lot of points where I'm like, okay, that could have been a little bit tighter. That felt a little bit sloppy. That felt just a little bit. I still fucking love this movie. I loved this movie. It was an instance where, and again, so few directors can pull this off. But again, I'm just chalking this up to just the Edgar Wright of it all. But the minute that the twist happens at the end, and I'm like, oh man, I called this, and I hate that I called it. The way that it panned out afterwards, I'm like, oh, let's fucking go. Like, I was just cheering. I was fucking cheering. I'm like, this is going into all the different places of genre that are so ridiculous and so over the top, but I absolutely loved it. It reminded me a lot of? It reminded me a lot of Luca Guadagnino's remake of Suspiria that he did back in 2018, which is a movie that like nobody watched. But the people who watched it loved it. Because it was fucking insane, because it just had such a different style and sensibility from so much of the generic muck that we've had so far this year. And Chris has brought this up a couple times where I tend to agree with him, which is where I'm like, look, even if it's not the best, I'll take something from an auteur that tried and didn't necessarily work all the way, rather than just another generic studio blockbuster. I think the only exception to that rule so far has been Halloween Kills, because I just don't know what the fuck happened with that movie. But like, yeah, you're totally right. All the Edgar Wright sensibilities are still there, like the quick cuts, the jukebox soundtrack, the inserts, the fast-paced style ability. Like, there's never a moment in this movie where I'm bored, which is really, really nice, because there's been a lot of movies this year where as fast-paced as they are, I'm just like, okay, when are we going to get to it? This is starting to drag, And I'm not even talking for like long movies, but like standard 2-hour movies. Or you just get something like Space Jam 2, which is just so all in your face that it literally becomes like a visual headache as far as the amount of shit that they're throwing your way. Just in general.
Yeah, I heard about that.
Oh, just you save yourself the effort. Just don't watch that in general.
It looks fine.
That's giving it too much credit, I think. But just I don't know. I enjoyed it so much. Just like the sense of style, the sense of reverie, the sense of nostalgia, the fact that like the fact that this movie is low key kind of like a warning about nostalgia, just in general. About it's like, okay, like kind of the differences between the generations, as far as like how younger generations typically look back at previous generations as like decades of old and look at them through rose-tinted glasses, but they don't actually understand what it was like because they didn't actually live in there. And I think that, to me, is what helps the twist and stops it from being super, super generic, because of the fact that it is still character motivated, and the fact that it does still play into that theme, which I really like. And like the whole film, throughout it. Like, that's not something that's like thrown in there last minute. Like, a lesser director would have just had to be like a generic horror movie, and then that last third act twist would have just been something like, oh, just an extra throw in there in order to try and have a half-cocked message. But Edgar Wright doesn't do that. He actually like attempts to throw in like this lesson about nostalgia, like from the beginning, like with the whole thing with her grandmother about, you know, going to live in the big city and actually understand what living in the big city is like versus wanting to live there. And with her, you know, meaning her flatmates, and understand, even though, yes, you're right, they did play to the 2000 Mean Girl types, you know, her still like, you know, the breaking down of like, you know, what she thought it was going to be versus what it is actually. And then kind of her journey as she goes throughout it, and she like sees all the visions through Anya Taylor-Joy's eyes, and like everything that she had to go through just in general. Particularly for me, the one haunting image, probably the most haunting image of the entire movie, is when she breaks through the veil or whatever, and you just have that one quick thing where the camera's going into all those rooms, and you see like the one girl's giving the old dude a blowjob, and the other girl is like threatening to kill herself, and the other girl is injecting herself with a needle, and the other girl is passed out of the table, clearly OD. Like, that was the most haunting shot for me of the entire movie.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the best horror is always the horror that's just a heightened version of reality anyway. You know, I could watch Deliverance and be far more scared than watching Nightmare on Elm Street. But I like what you said. I think it was well said, because it kind of... I watched a College Humor sketch a while ago, and it was about a girl who kept saying, I was born in the wrong generation. You know, I should have... I wish I was born in, let's say, the 90s. And then... this guy would say, "Oh, really? You wish you were born in the 90s?" And
then he goes through all the different.
He would list all these,
stuff,
all these like social, geopolitical problems that were going on, and basically every decade that, like, she was like, "Well, maybe I could live in the 20s or like the 70s or like the 1880s." It's like, "Oh, well, you couldn't vote here." Blah, blah.
Yep.
And you know, the movie is, and I mean this as a compliment, is almost just like a, you know, it's a version of that sketch where it's just asking the question like, "Oh, so you think you belong in a different generation?" Well, you know. This movie, this is an interesting thing I thought of, could have been made about any other generation. It could have been the 70s, the 80s, the 50s, the 40s. You know, you could have made this movie about objectification or, you know, any of those things, because those things are oddly, you know, problems that have existed for that long. And, you know, what was I trying to say? Basically, yeah, this movie could have happened in any other decade. And that's what's pretty interesting about it, is that it kind of unfortunately feels timeless, and it doesn't hit you over the head with this messaging. It just has it weaved throughout the story, as opposed to just baking it all in at the end. And then you go, wait, what was this about? Like, you know, even in the beginning, there's a scene with a cab driver, and then there's little moments here and there that kind of build this reality, you know what I mean?
Right.
So,
and I think that's really fascinating that you brought that up, because if we're talking about specifically the scene with the cab driver, that moment I was worried, because I thought, again, a little bit of a red herring, and this is how good of a director Edgar Wright is. I thought that we were gonna go into oh no, this movie's gonna be a finger wagging lecture about like, all men are pigs just in general, and all men suck in general. And I was really worried throughout that the movie was going to do that. And then with how it ended up wrapping up and kind of pulling its 180, I thought that it actually did it really tactfully and really, really interestingly. Because again, in a lesser director's hands, this movie would have been just slamming you over the head with its messaging. But I love the way you phrase that, where it's like, you're right. It was interwoven like really well. And like Edgar Wright, he was just recently on the Big Picture podcast, and the interview that he brought up was something really interesting, which is where he loves the idea of nostalgia, but at the same time, he doesn't want to make it like all about like, oh, remember the good times, like Stranger Things. Like, he said the big thing for him about Stranger Things, which he does enjoy, but the fact that, you know, he lived that, so like that's not really as interesting to him as it is for like the generation of now, you know. But he does find it interesting how like the generation now kind of sees the 80s and 90s the way he sees the 60s, is that Stranger Things is just kind of trying to replicate and recreate the magic of that for a new generation without actually having anything like underlying deeper meaning. And that's fine, right? That's not what the Duffer Brothers are trying to accomplish. No. But I like how he's trying to like make like a kind of, he's still trying to make like a fable about like the dangers of nostalgia and the dangers of getting lost in the past. Like I think, again, it goes back to me, one of the few brilliant moments of Game of Thrones before it just went off the rails in season 6, when Bran is doing his training with the three-eyed raven, when Bran's like, why didn't you stop me? You know, why did you stop me? And he's like, the past is like the sea, beautiful to look at, but if you get too lost in there, you can drown, you know? And I think that still applies to this movie like a lot.
Yeah, I mean, again, from an actual story perspective, it's a really, really good movie. And yeah, I totally agree with what you were saying. Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's some. I think the only thing holding it back, there's just like, there's little things here and there that could have been tightened up.
Well, let's talk about that. So, like,
but then again, too, it is subjective. So somebody else could say, I don't think it needed to be tightened up at all. And I say, yeah, okay.
True. Well, let's talk about that then again. So, what were some of the areas that you think it could have been a little bit tighter? Because for me, I'm interested to see if they kind of line up with mine.
For me, it's so minor. I just think there was certain script writing issues as opposed to big story points that I would have changed. And I actually loved the story from beginning to end. I wouldn't have changed any of that. There's just execution things I probably, would have changed in particular. Yes, like some, there's minor things that are kind of low blows to make, like, oh, the bully characters are pretty generic. But yeah, I just thought a lot of the dialogue for an Edgar Wright film was oddly unmemorable. Typically his films are, the dialogue is some of the best part, like so funny, where you're looking at Scott Pilgrim or even something like Baby Driver. It's really effective in key scenes. And I think there were a lot of key scenes that when I walk away from the scene, I went, I wish there was something more there. Particularly with the scenes with Terence Stamp. I wanted those scenes to have more of a punch. And I felt like whenever he was on screen, I wanted him to stay on longer. And that's not just because I love Terence Stamp. I love Terence Stamp. But I wanted more out of that character. And I think they were maybe hiding it because they knew they wanted to do some sort of twist. Because
of the red herring thing. Yeah, again,
and
we'll get into the twist a little bit, but I definitely see where you're coming from just in general. I think it's interesting because, again, so he's got a back and forth with like a couple of different writers. Obviously, he famously wrote Shaun of the Dead with Simon Pegg. He wrote Scott Pilgrim with Michael Bacall. And this film also is another one that he did not write himself. He wrote this famously with Krysty Wilson-Cairns, who co-wrote 1917 with Sam Mendes. It's funny. That's actually how they were introduced. I don't remember how, but Sam Mendes introduced them back in, I think, like 2016, 2017, like right around when Baby Driver came out. And then they ended up contacting her for writing. And so I find that really interesting because, again, my problems aren't necessarily with the little moments, but more so with like some of the moments at the ending. Like, not anything minor, but you're right. Like if anything, I'll say like kind of those moments were like they served to kind of decrease the characters to like just being plot MacGuffins that got the next point. Like, yeah, the mean girls, like, oh, they're only there in order to like get her out of the college dorm and into like the haunted dorm and into the haunted flat, and like the token like crush character, and it's like, oh man, and like Terence Stamp and how his entire thing is like he's really sinister and like really kind of scary in the moment, and then just how it ends with the whole freaking the twist that he's not actually who she thinks he is.
Yeah, that was
and then with the taxi cab thing, I'm like, really? So we're just doing the rule of threes, the motif to show that he's gonna get hit by the taxi cab? Okay, like.
Yeah, that was. Plus, interesting about that is he stood.
He stood
in the road for like.
The amount of times that he told her to not stand in the road. Like,
no, I know, but it's funny. But then when he's standing in the road, like he's standing there for like 15 seconds minutes. And then gets hit. And I know we're into spoiler territory now or something, but it was just one of those things where it was like, oh, he was just like I was expecting him to get hit, and then like 10 seconds went by. And then he got it. I was like, oh, okay.
It's like, need extra time to iron home the monologue that he was throwing out. And I love how, too, it's like, it's so clear. Like, it's just problems once the twist is revealed around who you think he is versus who he actually turns out to be, which is that. So, wait, if that guy was just a cop, then, but like he was a ladies' man, but why is he still?
And why did he say that he had to like correct them? And,
right, and like
he was saying all these things.
Weird. It's like one of those things where it's like the emphasis would put more into the twist than the actual like semantics of how it worked in, because they were clearly building up to the other big twist at the end.
Yeah, because when you think about that twist, which is kind of like twist 1 of 2, when you're thinking of that, it doesn't quite track as well with how the character's been acting.
Right.
But you kind of go with it. It's a minor issue.
I guess my only other point that I wanted to bring up before we got into like the big end all be all twist, because I think that's where it's going to come down to like what makes the twist at the end is what's going to make or break this film for a lot of people, which is, what did you think of how they characterized like the main character, like Eloise, Ellie for sure? What do you think of how they characterized her powers? Because I thought that was really strange. It's almost like the movie wanted to pretend like they didn't exist for the most part until they needed it to. If that makes any sense, because they're like, okay, we want to have it obsessed and have her be like within the dreams, but we don't want to have it be like a twist where she finds out halfway through that she has powers. We don't want that to be a story element. So that's established in the beginning. It's like, okay, she has these powers, but then they're kind of only used to like flesh out the plot details. And
yeah, it's funny. I didn't look at them as powers as much. Because there weren't any big moments where she's like harnessing energy or something like that.
True. But
I just looked at it as more that like, she's in this room. There are things buried in the room that are kind of, giving her these premonitions. And then when she goes to bed, it's it was almost like a Nightmare on Elm Street type thing where it's not so much a power that she has as it's this force that's just affecting her. I thought it was handled well. I see what you mean. Like when she's seeing her visions of the mom, that's like another kind of cliche, like, hi mom,
and like the whole thing with like the ghosts just randomly popping up in the library and her going crazy, or people thinking that she's going crazy because she starts threatening people because she can't distinguish between reality and dreams and all that. Like that was all good, but like those were the moments in the movie where I'm like, okay, this doesn't feel like wholly exclusive to Edgar. Like I've seen this before, it's like I feel like it's weird. You know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of the Guillermo del Toro movie that time forgot. I can't even remember that Crimson something.
Peak? I didn't see that.
Crimson Peak, that's the one. Yeah. Where the whole instance, right, is that it's like there are ghosts and like you think it's going to be a haunted house movie, but then it doesn't end up having anything to do with the ghosts other than they're just like trying to be warning signs. And they do something similar with that here where, all right, so this is where we're going to get into the big twist. So I will say, we've been mildly spoiling it throughout, but this is the this is going to be the big spoiler. So if you have not seen Last Night in Soho, this is definitely where you want to tune out. So the big twist at the end. So famously, it is known that a certain legendary actress who passed away last year during the pandemic, Diana Rigg, Olenna Tyrell, one of my favorite actresses, one of my favorite Bond girls, one of my favorite characters in Game of Thrones, was going to be in this movie. And because she died after filming this would be the last thing that she was in. So famously, the film was dedicated to her, right? So she comes in the movie and she plays, again, just the very sordid, very disillusioned, older woman, landlady for Thomasin McKenzie's Eloise character for this haunted apartment that she moves into. And then she sticks around for the rest of the movie. Like she keeps popping up in the movie. It's not one of those one-off roles. And about not halfway through the movie, because they use the ghost as a distraction, right? And then they have the Terence Stamp twist where one of the visions that Thomasin McKenzie sees when she goes into the past in her dreams is that Anya Taylor-Joy is picked up by Matt Smith, who seems to be like the snake charmer, and then is revealed to have been pimping her out to all these different clubs where she's just this act, and that's kind of like what leads into like a lot of like the disillusionment and realization of like, oh, the sparkly veneer of the 60s versus what it was actually like. And then after a while, she witnesses what she thinks is a murder. She believes that Matt Smith murdered Anya Taylor-Joy in the past and that Terence Stamp is the older version of Matt Smith. Well, it's revealed that Terence Stamp is not the older version of Matt Smith. Terence Stamp is actually the older version of this cop, this undercover cop, who randomly once had this conversation with Anya Taylor-Joy, right? And that's what's revealed.
Who had one scene.
Who had one scene, right? And it's funny because I was gonna guess it. I'm like, I feel like they're hovering on this scene for a minute, right? And then she has this thing where she's trying to break through and she's trying to, get in contact with her. And after a while, at the end, it is revealed that secretly she did not witness what she thinks she did. What actually happened was Anya Taylor-Joy actually killed Matt Smith in the past, along with every other one of the male suitors that she was set up with, and ended up becoming, what's the word that I'm looking for? Obviously a serial killer, but there's a term that's used for like women killers that specifically target men. There is a term for it, but I completely forgot the name of it. And it's revealed that Diana Rigg is the older version of Anya Taylor-Joy. And there's this moment at the end that plays out like a friggin' Austin Powers movie where she gives her the tea. And I'm like, oh no, the tea is going to be drugged because that was set up with the red herring earlier in the club. And then she goes in the monologue. I'm like, motherfucker, I called it. Diana Rigg is Anya Taylor-Joy. And the problem is I called the twist like 5 seconds before it happened. And I don't know, Brandon.
That's not really calling the twist.
I know, but I know it's you figuring it out because of, again, we've watched 1.5 million movies, so we know this. But like, Brandon, I don't know. Like, just talk about that for a second. Like, was it enough to ruin the movie for you? Because obviously, again, that's a very cliched moment that we've seen before, and then kind of how the rest of the third act transpires, just in general.
it's cliched in the sense that after it happens, you know the rest of the movie.
Yes.
So, and at that point, there's still like a good 10 minutes of the movie, and you typically want the final big 10 minutes of the movie to be the part where everybody's invested and things like that. And there is a slight factor of checking out because there's that part of your brain that's intrigued has checked out because now you go, oh, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, blah, 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 blah.
Yep. And it pretty much transpires exactly like how you would think.
Yeah, but it's still an enjoyable sequence that happens. It's well crafted. It's actually very well done with the way it incorporates music into it. I thought it was really cool.
Yes.
It feels almost... I almost feel the movie feels very Hitchcockian in a lot of ways to me because a lot of Hitchcock's movies, particularly the ones that deal with murder, have great tension. But then when you get to that final action sequence at the end, it feels oddly goofy. Whether you're talking about Shadow of a Doubt or even Psycho, like when he
even
comes
Psycho,
in, it's like,
the last 10 minutes of that movie, like I've got a rare. So here's the thing: I still love Psycho, but like the last 10 minutes of that movie where you just have the psychiatrist in there that's explaining it is the weakest part of that movie, and the reason why is because with focus groups of audiences didn't understand the twist, so they reshot that scene in order to add it at the end. That way they could like essentially explain to audiences like the entire plot of what was going on in Norman Bates' head.
Yeah, I mean, I like the twist. I like the sequence. I think for a final role for Diana Rigg, it's a great role.
Oh, it was awesome.
I think I actually really like the finale. Now that I'm thinking about it, I actually don't think that is a make or break thing for people. I think people who hate the movie, hate it for reasons that happened before that or hate it overall.
Yeah,
I don't think
a lot of the big criticisms that I was hearing was that they thought that it was trying too hard to be a Giallo or an Argento film, which I don't buy at all. I don't buy that at all, just in general. I think obviously Edgar, again, he's a lover of film history, so he's gonna have those stylisms in there, but I don't see this as being like a direct riff on any one of them,
No, and that's always that's a sketchy argument whenever you get into that in terms of like, oh, is this just a copy? I mean, it's very tough that you see a film nowadays. You go, wow, that was like this wholly original piece. Oh my gosh, like I've never seen that.
People have been going after Tarantino. People are still trying to go after Tarantino for years, saying that he ripped off Reservoir Dogs from that one Chinese movie that I can't remember the name of.
Oh, I don't know, man. That's a whole. At a certain point, you go, like, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I like the sequence. I think one problem that the movie had that I think that kept it from that next level is it develops and it creates a very mysterious atmosphere that delves into the supernatural and things like that. And at certain points, the dialogue is a little too in your face, and it's so full of clarity that it doesn't quite mesh as well with this mysterious, almost ambiguous atmosphere. I think the ending is very clean cut, and it gives you a lot of answers that you leave with like this little bow tied around everything. And you're just like, and I think with a film like this, some more subtlety and like a little bit of an ambiguous ending might have been like, oh, like it kind of adds to the overall mystery of the package and makes you think about nostalgia and things that are far in the past that you can't quite remember, so you're just kind of looking at references for it. I think especially when you get to the ending where her character Diana Rigg is talking to Thomasin McKenzie's character in the bedroom, and she says something like she just says what we're all thinking that they're thinking, right. And she just says it, and it just kind of like deflates the tension, and that's I feel like some subtlety and like not being so I think the dialogue kind of did a little too much work in that finale, but I still thought it was really enjoyable, and I thought the way the kind of subsequence in that sequence with Thomasin McKenzie in the bedroom with all the ghosts, I thought it was great. I thought it was awesome.
That was really cool.
It was a nice little mini twist. This whole movie's just like twists, like all the time.
Yeah, I felt like at a certain point it was like with the Community episode where Jeff and Annie are trying to get punk the Dean with the whole Dean dangerous thing, and it's just the twist upon the twist upon the double cross upon the double cross upon the twist. You know the episode that I'm talking about, conspiracy theories and interior design, where Annie pulls out the gun and shoots the professor, and then Jeff pulls out the gun and shoots Annie, and then the Dean pulls out the gun and shoots Jeff. It's like, it's just back and forth, and after a while the Dean is like, I don't even know what's going on. It's like, I don't even know who's on whose side or what's going on anymore. And then Jeff wakes up.
I think the finale was good. I didn't think it was bad. I don't think it was the make or break moment of the film. I think people were either bought in by that point, or they were just completely tuned out.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting seeing this movie's reaction going forward and see like how people are going to react, if this kind of has any lasting momentum, if this kind of ends up becoming like another like minor low-key like cult classic for Edgar Wright. Because it's interesting, right? Because Baby Driver was he's even said it's his biggest success ever, just in general, like his biggest box office success. But in a weird way, it's been 4 years since that movie came out, right? But it still almost feels like that movie came and went, right? Like it's like the movie the time forgot. Like I think you technical Oscars and that was it, maybe.
Well, because the movie was mainstream, in the sense of it was more conventional. And if you looked at the trailer, you said, oh yeah, like I understand this. The average moviegoer, can check in with that movie as opposed to watching the trailer for like, The World's End. And you're like, oh, what's going on there?
Yeah.
But yeah, I understand what you mean. The whole kind of came and went attitude with the movie. I enjoyed the film. I think it's not one of his best. I think, because I think it's a conventional story, but I don't think it was told in the most like unconventional way.
Right.
So it felt oddly just like a fun watch. And then you kind of, it's my opinion. And then I kind of, walked away and said, yeah, that was a fun watch, very well directed and well crafted and all that sort of stuff. Whereas with a film like this, the story is just more intriguing. It's not as conventional as you think it would be. I think by the third act, maybe some people think it's like, oh yeah, this is definitely a third act. Like I've seen this type of a third act before. Yeah. But even, with that, I think it's still, there's just more to it from a story perspective, from a thematic level. There's just a lot going on, so I know you didn't ask me, but I think I like it more than Baby Driver.
Definitely interesting. Well, that was going to factor into my last question before we wrapped up, which is, where does this rank for you within the Edgar Wright filmography? Because you've seen all of his movies, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say this goes right above Ant-Man.
Right above Ant-Man, the movie that he didn't direct?
Yeah, I would say that. No. So he's done 6.
Well, 6, 7 if you count the Sparks Brothers documentary that came out earlier this year.
I have never seen that.
Yeah.
So I can't include that.
So you cannot include that. So 6.
Scott Pilgrim versus the World, I think, is his masterpiece. I think that's a 100% perfect film.
That is a perfect movie.
I just think it's him firing on all cylinders. I love when you get to see a film and you're like, this director is just going at it right now. And I think that
every single moment from
it's one of the wittiest comedies I've ever seen. It's relentless. Every time I watch it, I find like a kind of new joke that I didn't get. Like I'm like, oh, look at that. So I'd say that's still my favorite of this.
For me, it's Milk and Eggs. Bitch still kills me every time, every single time.
Oh yeah, I always liked when they ran away and they do the high five and they're like, yeah, and it's like a slow.
It's like chicken. It's like chicken. Is it vegan? What?
Yeah, that movie. Oh my god, I always like the Chris Evans sequences.
Yeah,
just because of his voice. Like the part. Me and my brother and I always quote the part where he's on his phone. And he goes, "Haha, that's actually hilarious."
I love the scene. I love the scene where he's like, "What can I say? I'm nothing without my stunt team." And then it's all the duplicates.
And then the scene where it's like him acting in one of his kind of B action movies, and he goes into the phone booth. Remember? And when he goes into the phone booth, and it's just like the slightest detail that I only noticed like the 5th time I saw the movie, when he's punching in the number, he's using the barrel of the gun. So his gun is just going like, and he's doing the thing, and then he picks up the phone and does the call. It's like the smallest detail, and it's like one of the funniest bits in the movie. So that's still the best one, I think. Do you want me to give like what my list
just like quick power down?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so
all right. So I'd say Scott Pilgrim is the best, and then I would go Shaun of the Dead. Then I would go. I would say, okay, so I actually haven't seen Hot Fuzz in a long time. When I first saw it, I think it was because I saw it with the other two Cornetto movies, so I didn't quite like it as much as those two.
Right, because from what I've heard is that Hot Fuzz is like the least enjoyable / liked of The World's End. I famously still have not seen The World's End. So
you haven't? Well, I
have not.
I think people love Hot Fuzz. If you go on Letterboxd, I think that's
people
Edgar Wright's
love that
highest rated movie, Hot Fuzz. I just remember when I first saw it, I was like, okay, it was good, but I haven't seen it since. The other films I've rewatched, so my Hot Fuzz ranking might, it's going to piss people off, but like I'm just saying, I got to rewatch it. So I would say Scott Pilgrim, Shaun of the Dead. That's like top tier. Middle tier, I would say, is World's End, Last Night in Soho, and then I would put like Baby Driver, Hot Fuzz in like that third tier. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, with the exception of The World's End, I'd say my ranking is pretty much parallel. Like I said, if we're breaking it up into tiers, you got Scott Pilgrim and Shaun of the Dead in like the A tier. Then, Scott Pilgrim and Shaun of the Dead in the A tier, and then it would be like Last Night in Soho in like the mid tier, and then you have like Baby Driver and Hot Fuzz in the mid tier. Same thing. I watched Hot Fuzz years ago. Watched it with my brothers. They did not like it, to say the least. I'm like, I feel like this should be a lot funnier, but again, it's the whole thing with Edgar Wright. It definitely feels like they need repeat viewings, just in general. Like that's the thing that I found.
I liked it. Yeah, because his films get funnier like the more you watch it. Especially
like Shaun
those
of the Dead. I watched Shaun of the Dead 4 times, and every single time it got funnier. Like every single time, it just got like I just noticed some new joke. Yeah, for like
you said, I mean that movie's become like a staple of the zombie.
It really has.
Like it goes like Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead, and then like you go this, that, Shaun of the Dead. It's like
And like the irony of that is that when Edgar Wright was making that movie, people, it was released, like people didn't even know about, like they had no knowledge about like the original Romero trilogy in general. They didn't even realize that the title was like a play on it. And I think it's kind of ironic because Zack Snyder's remake of Dawn of the Dead came out that same year. But when people talk about which one is like more memorable, both 2004, the one that was written by James Gunn. But when you talk about which one is like kind of the more quintessential installment within the zombie canon, like most of the time people go with Shaun of the Dead.
Yeah, I mean, that's crazy. Like we had such a zombie craze, and like is zombies still a popular thing?
I don't know.
I remember back in the day.
We had Army of the Dead earlier this year, but that was mostly just like Zack Snyder just like having fun in kind of like the post Snyder cut like wave that followed on social media.
Well, basically after the Snyder cut, it's like he had like goodwill to just like do
pretty
whatever.
much do
and
anything.
Everyone's like, yeah, I got it.
And now he's essentially doing his own version of Star Wars for Netflix. So I'm like, hey man, I like Zack Snyder as a director. Yeah, it's this sci-fi movie. His next movie that he's doing, it's this sci-fi movie called Rebel Moon. Apparently, it's one of these movies that he's been like trying to make for like years. Well, it's because Netflix doesn't market anything. So Rebel Moon. I have no idea, but look, all I know is they just released an Army of the Dead prequel that Matthias Schweighöfer directed like last weekend, only 6 months after. So
I haven't seen Army of the Dead. I just remember back in the day for us, it's like
17 years ago, man.
Yeah, I was gonna say you had like Shaun of the Dead, Dawn of the Dead, but then later you had like Zombieland and then The Walking Dead.
Don't forget about 28 Days Later. That was all. That also came out within that time. 28 Days Later and 28 weeks later, all within that same time. Yeah. And don't forget too, we had World War Z.
That was later. That was
but that was like right on the when The Walking Dead just hit it huge.
I feel like World War Z was like jumping on that, like zombies are big now, but it just didn't hit, and it was like all right, whatever. But The Walking Dead, I don't hear anything about it now. Like I wonder. Zombies are still a big.
Well, it's funny because like we don't hear anything about it now because we've been tuned out. But dude, I still tune into The Walking Dead verse ever. So The Walking Dead is famously on its 11th and final season after Rick's gone. 11th and final season. Rick's gone. Carl's gone. I think
I've never watched it. I just know the names.
I think the only original cast members they still have Daryl. They still have Carol. The rhyme there. They still have Michonne and what's it called? And then Maggie, Lauren Cohan, just came back as well because her other show that she was going to do on NBC got canceled. And that's a thing. But they have 2 Walking Dead spinoffs. They're still working on greenlighting these Walking Dead movies. They've got so many Walking Dead video games. The Walking Dead property is still very, very much a hot button topic. There are still fans at the Comic-Con panel every single year. But I think the last season of The Walking Dead that I watched, I took a break seasons 4 and 5, and then I came back in season 6 because I knew that was when they were going to bring in Negan, and I knew Jeffrey Dean Morgan was playing him, and I'm like, oh hell yeah, let's go. And then they had the whole Glenn fake out, and then he just kills him again, and I'm like, all right, I'm done with the show.
So I just got a text from one of my friends who just saw Soho, and he said that, and he's a big Edgar Wright fan, and he loved, I think Shaun of the Dead's his favorite. He loved Baby Driver. And he told me, he got a vibe going into the movie that he might not like it. And I haven't asked him for details, but he said, yeah, I didn't like it.
That's interesting. That's very interesting.
I think that's, I think it makes sense, because I think the movie is, would you say it's out of the 6 films, it's the least Edgar Wright-y? I think I might say so. Because I think if you're looking at the Cornetto trilogy and Scott Pilgrim, that makes
that's
Edgar
like
Wright.
the main, you look at
it's really this or Baby Driver, and Baby Driver I think had those kind of kooky characters that were surrounding Baby. It had that kind of fun, random, relentless pace. I remember by the end,
the sense of, if we're talking it from that sense, where it's okay, I guess the Edgar Wright flair as far as a characterization standpoint, sure, but I guess because it's all the other sensibilities are still just as on fire. The other thing, obviously, too, is that this is his first film that he's done that doesn't have a male lead, so I think that might also be it. And yeah, it's sure in the sense of okay, the characters surrounding her are a little bit more traditionalist and not really the kooky, crazy, nutso, very apparent Edgar Wright characters we've come to notice about him. But so I guess if we're talking from that sense, sure.
But also I think the film has it has a message and a theme that is much more as soon as you see it, you get it, as opposed to his other films.
They're much more you can watch him once and miss him, but then you pick him up on repeat viewings.
Yeah, and even I'm sure an argument can be made that some of those films there isn't a huge message. If somebody was to tell me oh yeah, Hot Fuzz, Scott Pilgrim, I think that all 4 of those first Edgar Wright movies have something to say about man-child and responsibility and growing up and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And they're all set to these backdrops of very cool, traditionally guy shit, whether it's video games and rock or zombies and cops and, robots. What was the world's end?
Alien robots.
And Last Night in Soho is a very, obviously it's very relevant in terms of the climate today, but it's telling the story is very traditional. I would say compared to Baby Driver, it's probably the least Edgar Wright-y movie he's made, but I think I agree with what you're saying, where there's a lot in there that's, it still feels uniquely his, it tracks with his other films. I don't know if we're wrapping up yet, but I would just say,
I would tend to agree with that. Yeah, just in general. Yeah, as far as final thoughts go, really, the only thing I have that I love those points that you brought up. That those literally kind of brought up my points. Yeah, and as far as this not feeling like an Edgar Wright movie, that didn't necessarily impair on my enjoyment of the film. But I will say is that this is the film that definitely I'll say is problematic in terms of it's not the tightest script, and the story does have a lot of directions that it doesn't need to go in that it does. But I will say that for my money, I very, very much enjoyed my time. I'm glad that Edgar Wright added another really awesome installment to just his own filmography in the horror genre. I love that he's continuing to push himself in different directions as a filmmaker, which is something that so few filmmakers do. This wasn't an amazing movie, but for my money, still one of the most enjoyable watches of the year. I give this 4 out of 5 stars.
Yeah, I would mostly, I would mostly agree. I think, it doesn't quite reach the levels that you would think it could reach because of Edgar Wright. But I think I totally respect it for going in a different direction for him, even though it's more traditional in a lot of senses. I think technically it's a really well-made movie, just from all the people on the crew. I would agree that it's a fun watch. It's nothing that's gonna be remembered in that type of a sense where it's wow, remember Last Night in Soho? That movie came and was a big blip on the radar. It was just this huge thing. It's gonna be a movie that kind of comes and goes, I think. I still enjoyed it. I totally understand why someone wouldn't, because of the expectations going into an Edgar Wright movie. But I saw it with my mom, and she's very kind of mainstream movie fan, and she got a kick out of it. But that's kind of the vibe I think most people are going to get. They're going to say, I got a kick out of it. It was good. It was competent and things like that. So I really enjoyed it, but I also understand why someone would see it and go, all right. Three. I would go 3.5.
3.5 out of 5 stars.
Yeah,
Got it.
But 3.75 for some of the music.
3.7, of course, because I know you're a sucker when it comes to that kind of stuff.
They got it good, yeah.
Oh yeah, of course. Well, I mean that's an Edgar Wright staple. You gotta have it. But anyway, so that was our review of Last Night in Soho. Brandon, thank you so much for coming back on. Dude, again, this just shows you've got what it takes. I gotta have you back on at some point. I want you on the team here at Talkin TV. Who knows? Maybe I'll find a TV show for us to recap at some point, just in general.
No. Okay.
No, thanks. Way to tell me how you really feel, but no, just in general. Brandon, where can the good people find you on the interwebs?
Oh, geez. I guess Instagram. I would say Instagram, Brandon_Fallat, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not really on all of those as much anymore.
Oh man, haven't had Twitter in a couple of years, just in general.
I only got Twitter because a professor at college made us get Twitter, and then I deleted it.
Oh man, yep. I checked in on Twitter this year for the first time in.
Yeah, you know what I'll say LVB Productions is what my friend Lewis. Do you know Lewis? Did you ever meet Lewis Galarza?
I do know Lewis. Yes.
Oh, okay, yeah, we have a little bit of a production page where we just post random stuff that we're doing. So That's on YouTube.
Nice indeed. And of course, you can follow me at Movie Nerd Reviews on Facebook and Instagram, at Talkin TV Podcast on Facebook and Instagram. And be sure to click the subscribe button, click the like button, click the bell next to it. That way you guys get notified every time we put up new content. Of course, be sure to check out our latest Talkin' Thrones episode that we put up last night, myself and Professor Pat, where we talked about The Climb, episode 6 of season 3. And also be sure to tune into the next episode of The Succession season 3 recap that Dustin and I are doing every Thursday going forward. Brandon, thank you so much for being here. And as always, people, remember 12 seasons in a short film and watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys next time.